You can spot a true director in about 5 minutes. It really doesn't take any longer. If you've been around this business at all, you know a real director in 5 minutes. Richard Widmark was never just another actor. He was a true titan of classic Hollywood. His explosive performances literally shaped the golden age of cinema. But behind the blinding fame, a much darker story unfolded. A story of a man who faced one brutal struggle after another. From a forgotten small town in Minnesota to the glaring lights of Hollywood, his journey was a relentless, uphill battle. Do you truly know what Richard Widmark confronted to achieve that success? If you don't, you've come to the right place. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Richard Widmark and revealing the 5 actors he reportedly despised the most. But before we dive in, if you're a fan of Richard Widmark or you just love old gritty westerns, do yourself a favor and subscribe to our channel. We unearth the most amazing stories about western stars and the icons of classic Hollywood. Our story begins with Richard Widmark, born in the tiny town of Sunrise, Minnesota, but his family was never meant to stay put. Within a single year, they were uprooted and moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where his father, Carl Henry Widmark, had landed a new, demanding job as a traveling salesman. Not long after that move, Richard's mother, Ethel May, gave birth to his younger brother, Donald, on July 25, 1918. The two brothers immediately forged an unbreakable bond, and they would remain that close for the rest of their lives. Richard always credited his deep love for movies to his Scottish grandmother, who was a passionate fan of the cowboy star Tom Mix. She would whisk young Richard away to the cinema 2, sometimes even 3 times a week, starting when he was just 4 years old. That experience sparked a fire in him that would never be extinguished. The family moved constantly, always following Carl's work, but they finally put down roots in Princeton, Illinois. There, Carl purchased a bakery and named it Henry's Bakery. The family lived in the small apartment right above the shop, finally discovering a place they could truly call home. Richard Widmark started at Princeton High School, where he was a brilliant student, a force on the football field, and was even elected class president in his senior year. But during his junior year, his entire world was shattered. His parents, Carl and Ethel, separated. In the aftermath, Ethel stayed in Princeton, determined to raise Richard and his brother until they both graduated. Richard finished high school in 1932 and stormed into Lake Forest College on a scholarship, with a solid plan to become a lawyer. While at Lake Forest, Richard kept playing football and placed a stunning 3rd in a statewide speech contest. He was also drawn into college plays, though he was hesitant to admit he loved acting. He feared people would think it was a soft pursuit, but his passion for the stage only erupted. The biggest change, however, came the moment he met Ora Jean Hazelwood, a fellow drama student who shared his secret dream of acting. She would become the one great love of his life. Richard graduated in 1936 and was asked to stay at Lake Forest to help teach drama and speech classes. He stayed for 2 years, but by 1938, he packed his bags. He was headed to New York City for a long shot at radio, all thanks to a friend's offer. In a twist of fate, Jean Hazelwood was also in New York, studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Richard quickly landed roles in radio dramas, including the popular Aunt Jenny's real-life stories, and his career just exploded as he rushed between studios. On April 5, 1942, just months after America entered the Second World War, Richard and Jean were married in her hometown of Evanston, Illinois. Richard always maintained he never even flirted with another woman after meeting Jean. "I happen to like my wife a lot," he once revealed. Their marriage lasted for 55 years, completely free of any Hollywood scandal. Richard tried to join the military during the war, but he was rejected, dismissed because of a perforated eardrum. Meanwhile, a world away, his brother Donald was drafted, sent to the front lines in Europe in 1943. Then, a devastating blow struck. Donald's plane was shot down over the Netherlands. He was the only one from his crew to survive, only to endure over a year in a brutal German prison camp. And though he finally made it home, the war had left a brutal, unshakable mark. His health was shattered, plagued by severe headaches until, in 1951, his body betrayed him and he became partially paralyzed. The final, heartbreaking chapter came on December 22, 1955. Donald passed away from a brain tumor at the devastatingly young age of just 37. Richard did everything in his power to care for his brother, haunted by the belief that the government had dismissed the true depth of Donald's suffering. Back in 1943, while Richard Widmark and his wife Jean were consumed with worry for Jean's brother Donald, hoping he'd survive the war, Richard's own life was taking a completely different path. He was just beginning to build his career, making his stunning Broadway debut in Kiss and Tell. He also began performing for American troops with the American Theater Wing, and by that point, Richard was already earning a very comfortable living. His success erupted from his tireless work in radio and on the stage. Then, in 1945, their lives changed forever when Richard and Jean welcomed their only child, Anne Heath Widmark, on July 25th. And soon after, a call came that would change everything. It was a life-altering offer from the powerful 20th Century Fox executive, Darryl F. Zanuck. He was asked to play a vicious killer named Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death, starring Victor Mature. But there was a major obstacle: the film's director, Henry Hathaway. Hathaway just didn't see it. He dismissed Richard, believing he looked far too intelligent with his high forehead to ever be a convincing killer. But Zanuck insisted, and Richard got the part. Hathaway was not happy, and made the entire filming process a brutal experience for him. The irony was, Richard only wanted the role because it was being shot in New York. What no one expected was that this was his very first movie. And in the very first scene he ever filmed, he unleashed a truly chilling performance as Tommy Udo, famously pushing an elderly woman in a wheelchair down a long flight of stairs. The shocking act was punctuated by a wild, creepy laugh that would echo through movie history. That single, brutal scene earned him an Academy Award nomination. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor and ultimately won a Golden Globe as the most promising male newcomer. Richard would later joke about it, saying, "I thought this acting thing was easy. I haven't won anything since," but he also admitted something startling. When he saw himself on screen for the first time, he was absolutely horrified. He recoiled, saying he couldn't even stand to look at that person. But the audiences, they were hooked. They loved to hate his character, and Fox immediately locked him down with a 7-year contract. A stunning turn of events since he'd originally signed a bad deal, just to land the Tommy Udo role. By 1948, he was starring in Yellow Sky, alongside the legendary Gregory Peck and Ann Baxter. That same explosive year, he also appeared in Roadhouse with Celeste Holm and The Street with No Name, with Lloyd Nolan and Barbara Lawrence. The momentum didn't stop. The very next year, in 1949, he acted in Down to the Sea in Ships, sharing the screen with the great Lionel Barrymore. By 1950, the studio saw a major star and handed him 2 huge projects. The first was a thriller called Panic in the Streets. It was directed by Elia Kazan, an old friend from his Broadway days, the very same man who had pushed Richard to audition for Kiss of Death back in 1947. And even though the film was packed with stars like Jack Palance and Zero Mostel, it flopped financially, mostly because it was filmed on location in New Orleans, which made the production far too expensive. Next, Richard starred in No Way Out, a deeply charged racial drama. He was cast alongside Sidney Poitier and Linda Darnell, playing a virulent racist named Ray Biddle. It was a role he recoiled from, a part he desperately wanted to refuse. But behind closed doors, the studio forced his hand. After every intense, brutal scene, Richard would immediately turn to Poitier and apologize, saying, "Sid, you know this is just acting, right?" Poitier, a true professional, always reassured him, saying, "Dick, I get it. I'm an actor too." They forged a deep friendship, and Sidney would later reveal that Richard was the very first person in Hollywood to invite him over for dinner. A stunning act of kindness that meant the world to him at the time. But before we explore the rest of Richard Widmark's life, let's get to the heart of this story. In 1951, Richard Widmark appeared in Time's Halls of Montezuma *, a brutal World War II film set on a Japanese-held island. He starred alongside his old friend from his radio days, Carl Malden, as well as Jack Palance, Richard Boone, and a very young Robert Wagner, who earned his first ever credited role in this film. The very next year, in 1952, Widmark shared the screen with the one and only Marilyn Monroe in Time's Don't Bother to Knock asterisk. Richard once described Marilyn as a fragile soul, like a wounded bird. She desperately craved fame, but was absolutely terrified of everything that came with it. She would often hide away in her dressing room for hours, and by late afternoon, the exhausted crew would beg her to come out just so they could finally go home. She struggled to remember her lines, and during filming, you would have sworn her performance was a disaster, but once the film was edited and up on that big screen, she was stunning. And despite explosive rumors that Marilyn often had flings with her co-stars, Richard was clear, "Not with me." He said she didn't even flirt. Then, in 1954, he worked with Robert Wagner again, this time alongside the legendary Spencer Tracy in Time's Broken Lance asterisk. This film marked the breaking point in Widmark's 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox. At 40 years old, he knew it was time for a change. He was completely exhausted from jumping from one movie to the next without a single break. But more importantly, he was convinced he could earn far better money as an independent actor. His daughter, Anne, revealed that her father was always a family man at heart who preferred a quiet, simple life at home. Around this time, Richard and his family were living on a peaceful ranch in the San Fernando Valley. Craving more creative control, Widmark took a leap and launched his own production company, naming it Heath Productions after Anne's middle name. But 1956 brought devastating personal heartbreak. His dear mother, Ethel May, passed away just 1 year after the shocking death of his brother, Donald. Now, though Widmark rarely spoke publicly about his Hollywood rivals, behind closed doors, insiders and co-stars have whispered for years about the actors who truly rubbed him the wrong way, whether it was their ego, their laziness, or their shameless showboating. Widmark had little patience for those who didn't take the craft as seriously as he did, and according to those who knew him well, there were 5 actors he just couldn't stand, no matter how famous they became. Number 1. Frank Sinatra. The chairman of the board may have charmed the world, but he did not impress Richard Widmark. The two worked together on Times, the Detective Times, in 1968, and the experience reportedly left Widmark absolutely fuming. Sinatra's casual, dismissive attitude toward the craft, his habit of showing up late, and his demand to shoot scenes quickly with almost no preparation were the polar opposite of Widmark's disciplined, meticulous approach. One crew member later revealed that Richard thought Frank was all charisma and zero commitment. To Widmark, acting was sacred. To Sinatra, it seemed, it was just another gig. Number 2. Marlon Brando. Widmark had deeply mixed feelings about Brando. He acknowledged the younger actor's undeniable talent, even his brilliance, but he couldn't stand his method acting antics. Brando's explosive, unpredictable behavior, his refusal to memorize lines, and his constant improvisation. It irritated Widmark to no end. While they never shared a scene, Widmark's words once cut through the noise, revealing his philosophy: "Some actors need chaos to create. I prefer focus." It was a subtle jab, but many believed it was aimed squarely at Brando. And that brings us to number 3, Tony Curtis. During the filming of Time's The Long Ships, Times in 1964, Widmark and Curtis were co-stars on paper, but behind closed doors, they were far from friends. Curtis was notorious for his vanity, reportedly spending more time in the makeup chair than he ever did with the script. He treated the set like his personal fashion show, while Widmark arrived ready for battle. Their behind-the-scenes tension was explosive. Everyone could feel it. One production assistant later revealed a shocking detail. Widmark didn't resent Curtis for who he was, but for the man he pretended to be. To Widmark, Curtis was all style and no substance. Number 4. Robert Mitchum. Laid back, boozy, and famously indifferent, Mitchum was Hollywood's cool cat. But for Widmark, that nonchalance bordered on brutal disrespect. Mitchum often boasted about his lack of preparation for roles, once declaring, "I just show up, hit my mark, and say the lines." For Widmark, who treated every role like a war to be won, this attitude was infuriating. Though they were titans of the same era, their philosophies were from different worlds. "You don't coast through greatness," Widmark once muttered to a friend after watching a Mitchum performance. And then there was number 5, Kirk Douglas. This is perhaps the most stunning name on the list. Both men were tough, intense, commanding actors, and maybe that was the very problem. They were too much alike. Widmark was convinced Douglas was a scene stealer, constantly trying to upstage everyone around him. His booming voice, his theatrical expressions, his relentless need to dominate every frame, it all rubbed Widmark the wrong way. The whispers in Hollywood claimed Widmark once turned down a major role opposite Douglas, saying, "There's only room for one storm in a scene, and Kirk brings the whole hurricane." Yet despite these personal grievances, Richard Widmark always remained professional on the surface. He was never the man to air dirty laundry in public or feed the gossip columns, but those closest to him told a different story. He believed that actors had a profound responsibility to the audience, to the script, and to each other. When someone disrespected that, whether through a massive ego or sheer laziness, he took it personally. In 1957, Richard Widmark starred alongside Richard Basehart and June Lockhart in Time's Time Limit ***. Just 1 year later, he appeared with Doris Day and Gig Young in Time's The Tunnel of Love ***. That very same year, he also teamed up with Robert Taylor and Patricia Owens for Time's The Law and Jake Wade ***. By then, Widmark had become a household name, a titan of Hollywood. When someone asked if fame had shattered his privacy, he simply dismissed it. "I don't care how well known an actor is, he can live a normal life if he wants to." Then, in 1960, Widmark confronted the role of Jim Bowie in John Wayne's epic production of Time's The Alamo ***. But what no one expected was that Wayne originally wanted him to play Colonel William Travis, not Bowie. He even told the 5'10" Widmark, "You're not big enough to play Jim Bowie," but Widmark's reply was icy and confident. "I will be," he said. And he proved it. The very next year, in 1961, Widmark starred in the Western Times, Two Rode Together Times, with James Stewart and Shirley Jones. He later shared that on set, director John Ford and Jimmy Stewart were almost always arguing, mostly about an old, beat-up cowboy hat that Stewart stubbornly insisted on wearing. It was a hat he'd used in several other westerns, a quiet symbol of the behind-the-scenes tension. And in a devastatingly honest confession, Shirley Jones later admitted that Richard Widmark was the only leading man she had ever truly fallen in love with. She recalled how both he and Stewart were so kind, so protective of her, confessing, "Though nothing ever came of my feelings, maybe that's why I loved him." That very same year, Widmark took on the demanding role of the American prosecutor in the explosive film *Judgment at Nuremberg*. He held his own, starring alongside screen legends like Spencer Tracy and Burt Lancaster. Then, in 1962, he joined a true powerhouse cast. The names were stunning: John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Gregory Peck, Debbie Reynolds, Carol Baker, and Henry Fonda, all for the epic film Time's How the West Was Won ***. The movie was a massive gamble, with a staggering $15 million budget, but it erupted at the box office, earning the studio over $50 million. By 1964, it seemed Widmark and his wife, Jean, had found their sanctuary, enjoying a peaceful life on their 20-acre estate in Connecticut. In 1966, the screen called him back for Time's Alvarez Kelly ***, a gripping Civil War drama where he co-starred with William Holden and Janice Rule. The following year, he starred in Time's The Way West Times with the formidable Robert Mitchum and Kirk Douglas, just 2 years after his last major role. Then, devastating news shattered his world. His father, Carl, had passed away in New Orleans at the age of 70. In 1974, Richard Widmark appeared in Time's Murder on the Orient Express ***, surrounded by an iconic cast that included Lauren Bacall and many others. Later, in 1982, he teamed up with his dear friend Sidney Poitier for the film Time's Hanky Panky ***, starring alongside the brilliant Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner. But by 1987, at 72 years old, Widmark had reached a breaking point. He admitted the magic of filmmaking was gone, revealing, "I've realized in my old age that making movies just irritates me. I've only got a few years left, and I don't want to spend 12 hours on set just to shoot 2 minutes of footage." It was a shocking admission from a man who had appeared in over 70 films, a legacy too vast to simply list. He was a legend, especially in westerns. That same year, in a candid interview with Times Times magazine, he revealed a bizarre side of fame. A woman once stormed up and slapped him on the street, calling him a little squirt, while another time, things got even more intense. A large man confronted him at a restaurant and knocked him clean out of his chair. "This acting business is something else," he laughed, when asked if he was smart with his money. Like so many stars who lost it all, Widmark just joked, "No, I'm just cheap." Then, in February of 1990, at age 75, he received one of his highest honors, the prestigious D.W. Griffith Lifetime Achievement Award. His cherished friend, Sidney Poitier, presented it to him. A visibly moved Widmark said, "Sid, I can't believe you came all the way to California just for this." Poitier's reply was simple and devastatingly loyal. "For you, Dick, I would have walked." But that same year of triumph was shattered by tragedy. Behind closed doors, Richard's beloved wife Jean received a devastating diagnosis, early-stage Alzheimer's. After her diagnosis, he stepped away from acting to care for her full-time. He returned only once more, in 1991, for a single film. That film was Time's True Colors, Times with John Cusack and Imogen Stubbs, a commitment he felt he had to honor. What followed were 7 brutal years for Richard. He and their daughter, Anne, watched, heartbroken, as the woman they loved slowly faded away. On March 2, 1997, the long, painful battle ended. Jean passed away from Alzheimer's in Santa Barbara, California, leaving behind a grieving family and a husband who had devoted his entire world to her in those final years. Just a few months after Jean passed, Richard decided to sell their beloved 80-acre ranch in Hidden Valley. Without her, the silence was shattered. It just wasn't a home anymore. Then, 2.5 years later, on September 27, 1999, in a move no one expected, 84-year-old Richard married 71-year-old actress Susan Blanchard, a longtime family friend. Richard once shared that Susan had always been incredibly kind to Jean. The couple then settled into a quiet life together in Roxbury. Back in Connecticut, in 2002, Richard received a truly stunning honor, an induction into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. It was a proud, defining moment in his later years, but a dark shadow was looming. By 2007, his health began a devastating decline, and a brutal fractured vertebra only made the struggle worse. Then, on March 24, 2008, the fight was over. At the age of 93, Richard Widmark passed away peacefully in his Roxbury home. His friends remembered a gentle, honorable man, and in a fitting final act, he departed this world just as he had lived in it, quietly.